Fala galera, o Dilo Júnior aqui da Hard, estamos no último dia de evento, mas ainda temos um papo fantástico aqui na trilha de hardware do Case Startup Summit. Esse painel terá um convidado super especial, será em inglês, mas vocês podem acompanhar todas as legendas em português aqui embaixo. E agora vamos começar a falar em inglês. So, welcome everyone to this special fireside chat here on our last day at Case Startup Summit. It's an honor for me to talk with someone that started the movement of hardware startup accelerators, and of course, was an inspiration for us here at Hearts. And with us today, Cyril, the founder of Hex, the world's first hardware startup accelerator, and general partner at SOSV, on one of the most known venture capital firms in the world. So, Cyril, thank you so much for joining us today, and say hello to Brazil and Latin America.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. So first of all, man, I gotta ask, I saw in your Twitter profile and it says like visionary punk. And I thought it's awesome. But can you tell us what does that mean?
Yeah, so it's actually a very old nickname that when I met my future partner, so Sean O'Sullivan, who founded SOSV, he introduced me to one of another partner that will become another partner with that title. Saying that I was at that time I was still young. I was in my 20s, and so I was kind of a punk and still a bit of visionary, as he likes to call me, which is kind of overbloated. But it's always stick with me quite a bit just as a joke. And maybe not, I'm in my 40s, so maybe I'm going to kind of evolve and become more of a new wave punk, if you will, at some point.
Awesome. Yeah, amazing story. So let's talk a little bit about a few years back. I think when everyone was looking to invest in SaaS or mobile startups, and I think we actually see this today, and we still have a lot of fun focusing more on SaaS than in hardware. But you were creating Hex and starting to invest in hardware. I don't know, maybe people call you crazy at the time. But can you tell us a little about how Hex started and what was the motivation behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's still a bit crazy today. So it's interesting to think that almost, back in 2012, when we got started, it was really kind of an idea out there. I think the origin was I was in China. We just got started with another program called China Accelerator, which is based in Shanghai. And we actually started to work with some hardware companies back then. I made a couple investments, one in a company called Formlabs, which does 3D printing, another one called Leap Motion that was doing hand recognition. Both had kind of different interesting fate, but I just got into it because I thought it was an interesting challenge. It was really all the rage about lean startup back then, and I was wondering if that will apply to hardware startups. At that time, I didn't know much about hardware. I was really a software guy, but I was in China, and so I thought it would be interesting to kind of dig in to what will it take to help startups from scratch, essentially build a hardware product. I went to Shenzhen, China, where the supply chain essentially, kind of is based right in front of Hong Kong. What I saw then was actually quite interesting. It was there was a movement in China back then called Shanzhai, which actually was about incremental innovation and creating products from an existing product, kind of mix matching products. An example of that would be a mobile phone that also had a razor. So you just could remove it and raise yourself while actually calling someone, I guess, or being on the move and having both of them. Never forget your razor type of thing. So that was an example of Shanzhai. And as you know, of course, this is a silly idea, but it was interesting to think that you could buy this device for literally $100 or something, which means that behind it there is a whole machine that helped to create these kind of devices and to manufacture those devices at low scale. So low scale will be maybe a few thousand devices. It happens that it fitted perfectly with the world of startups, right? It was about how do you get into building a new product from scratch, and how do you do a few prototypes, then how do you do 100 units, and then how do you do 1,000? So interestingly, my the insight here was that we would set up in Shenzhen, not in order to actually manufacture, but in order to create products from scratch. So use it really as a big prototyping game. And I was fortunate enough to meet a lot of people that were thinking similarly back then, and they were all in Shenzhen at the same time. So I built hacks with a couple of very important people. One called Zach Smith, who founded MakerBot, which sold to Stratasys a few years later. And another one that was also very important to us, called Bunny Huang, who is famous in the world because he hacked the Xbox, actually.
Oh.
And both had great expertise in both software, hardware. That really helped me to get started, and then have our first investment and set up in 50 square meters back then. Nowadays we have more than 5,000 square meters in Shenzhen.
Awesome. Wow, like crazy journey. So, but as you mentioned, you talked about software, hardware startups. In your experience, what are the main difference between startups of hardware and software?
Yes. So there are plenty that are kind of obvious to everybody, right? In terms of having to manage, a different type of team, of course, because you need to have, electronics engineering, mechanical engineering, industrial design, firmware engineering, software, of course, for everything else. So there is the team, typically has to be slightly larger than a software team just in order to get started. Of course, because it's a larger team, you have your burn is higher because you have to buy now some materials. Then your burn is even higher. You start to make one device and you have to make 100, maybe 1,000, and build up inventory. And so typically, this kind of venture has a lot of different dynamics. Also, it takes typically more time in a way to see traction. There are lots of good stuff that can happen, and we can talk about that later. So, but all that is kind of obvious, I think, to the audience that doesn't really want to get into it, or those who got into it and saw the hardships of building a hardware startup. But I think there is actually an even more important difference, and it's that when you build a software startup, you can do it from behind your computer. You can just sit there and just do it, and that's about it. But with hardware, you actually have to move for the most part, or if you don't have to move because of you can't, you will at least have to communicate with different people. And so if you have to boil it down, essentially, the one difference is that you can be successful on your own building a software startup. You cannot be successful on your own building a hardware startup because you have to collaborate with suppliers. You have to collaborate with manufacturers. You don't have your own facility for the most part. Sometimes you can have it, but it's expensive, or it depends on the types of products. But for the most part, you will always have to communicate, work with people to get your parts, work with people to get the manufacturing done, the distribution done, and many other things. So in a way, building a hardware startup is much more collaborative. You have to, from the get-go, to think that the skills that are required are, one of those is at least excellent communication skills.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned that, so there's a lot of harder stakeholders, and I think the interaction for the product development is a little bit different, right, than the software. And the first thing that came on my mind was, does the lean startup cycle that Eric Ries created work for hardware startups? And how can I iteratively build a hardware product? Is that work? How you see that?
Yeah. We actually I shared it many months ago with Steve Blank and then Eric Ries about it actually, and we concluded that it's it's the same thing in terms of iterations. At the end of the day, you want to have cycles of iteration. So that idea wasn't even new before startup. You got popularized as a recently, but the hardship of it in the hardware space is that testing your hardware requires you to go to the place where you can test it, and sometimes you can make focus groups if it's consumer, or you can go to a client to do some pilots, but all of those are much more complex, requires much more time. And also, I would say that one of the hardships in terms of lean startup is that it's really hard to fake things. You can go into making your frameworks in the software space. You can, not really code, right, and make something kind of work and magic, and people react to it and think it's interesting. In the hardware space, sometimes the issue is that the expectations are fairly high, and it's really hard to kind of figure out what will happen in front of a consumer, if it's consumer, or in front of corporations, because they have expectations that are kind of all over the map. If it's consumer, it can be really hard. Now they're expecting Apple quality essentially, which means that the end of the lean startup cycle is when the product is on the shelf, or online, and does someone buys it, or if you go even further, does someone actually subscribe on a monthly basis and use it? In the corporate space, it's kind of often the same thing. Like, people don't really like to see something that is ugly, even though it does the thing. There is a kind of humans behind it, and so there are many hardships. But so same principle, just more cycles, and on a much longer time frame.
Yeah, amazing, absolutely. And well, I need to say that you especially talk about the team on hardware. It's a little bit different to work this iteration out. So here at Hards and Darwin, you have this strong focus on the founders. So as our head of people would say, we are human driven. So we are deeply focused on finding the right team, and after that we analyze the product, the market, and other aspects of the startups. But how do you see like the perfect team to start a hardware startup? What the characteristics of the people, and soft and hard skills?
Yeah, I would say that they have kind of changed over time in many ways. Like 10 years ago, only the really brave were getting into hardware. It took quite a bit of leap of faith and being a bit crazy to actually do it. So most of the people were kind of hackers, if you will, and they were playing in particular. Things got popularized a lot thanks to open source hardware that really pushed the tools for people to actually have the microcontroller ready on one side, or the computer, Raspberry Pi of sorts and whatnot, and the tools on the other side with 3D printing, which was also very important for a hardware startup to develop. But in order to actually use those tools, you needed to tinker. So tinkerers were kind of the people that were building those products back then. And they had their limitations, of course, because they had to kind of help build the ecosystem and help better the tools. Nowadays, the tools are fairly robust. Of course, they're not perfect, but you can really get far, if you will, not with a minimal amount of knowledge about them, but with practice that was not existing before. And therefore, it's not that the technical skills are pushed back. They went elsewhere. Some of them went into being much more hardcore. So actual technologies. I don't know. New types of batteries, or new types of textiles or whatever. So sometimes the technology aspects is not anymore into how to connect it to the internet or that kind of thing, right? It's really about making something much more complex. In some other cases, it went into software because predictive maintenance, for example, doing lots of AI, or connectivity is still a problem, from afar, that can also be solved by nodes of sorts, or it can be about computer vision as well. So the skills kind of move that way. And that's for the technical side of things. For the business side of things, it also depends on what the venture is about. Sometimes it's designer-led, because it might be very important for the product to have strong designs behind it. Some other times, really what I would be looking for is not too different from software. It's really about the unfair advantage, really about always the insights that someone has about a certain market in order to build a better product. And so we see, the last 3-4 years have been really about those people that are not necessarily super tech savvy, but have that background of really coming out of corporations, for example, and really knowing what they're supposed to do. And that can also be a very strong, overall company being built from that aspect.
Awesome. Yeah, great insights as well for the ones who want to create a harder startup. So, but let's talk a little bit more about hacks. And as we mentioned earlier, you created the world's first harder focused startup accelerator. And you have a program that in both cities, Shenzhen and San Francisco. Why did you take this approach?
Yes. So it's the way I see hardware, building hardware, as I mentioned, is a lot of communications. But being I've been on the road for about 20 years myself. I lived in many countries, and what I think entrepreneurs should do is always to go to leverage the best ecosystems. And for a long time, we thought that there was no ecosystem, right? It was the world was flat in many ways, and becoming kind of commoditized. And then Silicon Valley was kind of the first ecosystem popping out long time ago in a way, but really 30 years ago, if you make it quick in New York for other aspects, and now you see other cities that are popping out with various specialties around the planet. And Shenzhen was one of them that really had the time to specialize into supply chain. Really, like the whole of China is strong in manufacturing in general. In some manufacturing, not all of it. Actually, there are other countries that are better in textile, for example, or in wood, or in many other things. But for electronics, Shenzhen was kind of the obvious place to be. And as we were there, we also invested in mainly foreign startups from the Chinese point of view. Only 15 or 20% of our investments are in Chinese teams, which means that the rest is in US and Europe and rest of the world. And so we brought all the teams there, and then typically those companies will either go back to their home country, or we thought that in some cases, and in many cases, they should spend some time in the Silicon Valley in order to get a good feel for it, first of all, but also, of course, for sales and marketing and for fundraising. It was important to spend some time there, not necessarily to raise immediately, although of course many companies have done that, but maybe after, like getting known, getting access to mentorship, and feeling inspired and continue to move on. So some decided to stay there because they found a client, they found investors. Some others have found investors but decided to go back to their country in order to develop their product some more before coming back to the US at some point. So there is no one role to fit them all. It's really on a company per company basis, but I think in the future you will see more and more countries and cities around the world that the teams of a certain kind should spend more time there and leverage the ecosystem as much as they can.
Yeah, and this is truly important for the journey, right? To leverage the ecosystem where they are. And I think, can you share a little bit with like one of the startups that went through the program, completed the program, and what was the advantage of being on the program in Shenzhen and then going to San Francisco? If you can share some examples of some portfolio companies.
I'll take like an old one because we had time to think it through, and they've been it's been fun to watch their journey. So during the second program, which was in 2012, we had a couple companies that were there, and one was American, called back then it was called Spark. Today it's called Particle. Those in hardware space will know them because they develop connectivity for devices. And there was also another one which was Chinese, which back then was called Yilink. Nowadays it's called Yelite, and which is known today for being one of the largest maker of lamps and LED products in general in China. And what's really interesting is that so Particle, wasn't called that back then, but came over to Shenzhen with the idea that they will essentially build a connected lamp of sorts. But they wanted back then to connect incandescent light bulbs, the ones that you can screw. And so they were kind of tinkering with that, and they had a Kickstarter campaign actually that failed about bringing that online. And what was interesting to be inside of the supply chain for them was that the first meeting that I had with them, I remember, was like, okay, it's cool what you are building, but there is a little bit of a problem with it. And I was like, look over the window. So they look at the window, and there was a giant billboard on because we were inside of Huaqiangbei, which is the electronics market. So there was a giant billboard written LED. And LED was very new back then, and I was like, that may be kind of the future here, not light bulbs. And so they went on to the factory in order to find LEDs and lamps that were using LEDs. They hacked that LED on the spot, literally inside of the manufacturing plant. They were hacking it to connect through Wi-Fi, and it worked. And then they had the idea to actually create a platform for other things to connect to the internet, which became Particle, which now does Wi-Fi, 3G, 4G, 5G, whatever, all those things used by millions of people around the planet. So that's how transformative the experience can be. And for the side note, which is so Particle went on to raise I think $70 or $80 million to date. A side note for the fun story is that the other team that was in front of them, so-called Yilink, was actually building a platform to connect objects to the internet in China. And during the program, they actually switched to build connected LED lamps. So they kind of cross each other. And Yelite has also raised more than $100 million to date. And so they were transformed as a Chinese team in a very different way by being connected to the foreign teams as well, and benefiting from the Shenzhen environment. They were not from Shenzhen; they were from Qingdao, and both became really large companies today. So I think that can be done many times over. It's really a transformative experience.
Great, yeah, amazing. And as we are talking about the HEX program, I think I saw on your website that it says that the programming changing is 111 days. Is that correct? And
yes.
Why?
I think it was quite arbitrary. We always felt that 3 months was not enough to build a hardware product. And so it was kind of 4 months and then some, essentially. The reality is that today the teams are staying as long as they want, or not as short as they want, but in many ways they also can stay longer because we are also building extremely complex hardware and robotics and whatnot. And so what has changed over the years, which is quite interesting for us, is that the first year, as I mentioned, we had 50 square meters, and we actually decided to keep some space for the alumni in Shenzhen. Of course, you have to understand that it's very particular. If you are building hardware, that means that you will have a link to Shenzhen forever, essentially. So the teams who are going back to their country or whatever, and then coming back to Shenzhen to do more development or manufacturing or other things. And so we decided to actually kind of push the walls and extend the office little by little. So we moved essentially every single year. We've moved the office, believe it or not, because the number of alumni started to stack up. So we moved to another office for 100 square meters, then 200, then 500, then 1,000, then 2,000, and wow. Finally we decided to bite the bullet and do a 5,000 square meters office that can fit 300 people. And so what's great about it is that the team, like there are of course many teams in there, and so when you come into the ecosystem, you can go and talk to everybody. Some of them have many employees around the world, and maybe keep 5 people there or something, and so we help them with that. Many others have been, of course, they've all been through the program. They've some of them have shipped the product, some of them have fundraised, some of them have sold things, and so it's very convenient for people to stay inside of it. And they find it very comfortable. So sometimes, they will stay more than 111 days.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned the hardware ecosystem, and I think I saw another talk that you said in 2013 that hardware is the new black. So hardware startups were trending, as we saw years back in Silicon Valley. The hardware started the movement from Hewlett-Packard and Apple and stuff. So, but how do you see the hardware ecosystem right now? Not only in Shenzhen, but that is like the hardware center of the world, but in other countries in Europe, Latin America. What do you see now from the time you started Hex?
Yes, well, I think it's quite undeniable that hardware is everywhere in many different ways and shape and forms, and hardware, as in at least computers essentially, are getting into everything. So that trend has been expanded to cars, expanded to rockets, and expanded to your shopping cart and whatnot. So things have happened from that angle for sure. And a clear sign of that is also that big companies that were not doing hardware went into it. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, they all have hardware. 10 years ago, there was nothing. And so you can see kind of if you want to exist in the software world, you also have to exist in the hardware world. And we've also seen, some successful startups, of course, and IPOs and exits, of various kinds. The latest one being Peloton, overall, it's been, I would say, so you can see things are happening from a startup perspective, but then you can also see that from a big company perspective, they became a lot more aggressive about it. And so, interestingly, back in 2010, being inside of the supply chain showed that it was a big company thing. Like doing hardware was really, you were a big company, you were a Panasonic, you were, a Sony, you were a GE, you were doing hardware. And so there was a bit of an opening with that open source and other things that created those startups. And one of the key questions I have, at least on the consumer side, is whether or not that window is going to close again because of big companies, making drones and acquiring companies like Ring for, a couple billion, that kind of thing is consolidating, some of the startups. At the same time, every day there are, funding happening, and there are good companies being built. So we'll see. But I would say that on the consumer side, it's becoming harder and harder. And so that leaves the B2B side of things that has been growing by leap and bounds in the last 3 years. In particular, with digital maintenance, with asset tracking, automation at large, and robotics, have all been really, an important driver for investors and for markets. And I will say that one of the shortfalls in a way is that it took a long time, and we still don't have the one company that illustrates the power of that. There has been spectacular failures, both on the consumer side and on the robotic side. Those were kind of the 1.0 generation. I think there are better generations that are coming up, and so we'll see how they fare. But at the end of the day, you will have thought that things got easier, and they got easier in some ways, and they got harder in different ways, in particular in terms of distribution, access to customers, and many other things. So things are always evolving. We're still extremely bullish on hardware, still investing in 40 companies per year in that space. We are getting better at it. The companies are getting better at it. And I think there is also an acceleration of the development and how long it takes for a company to get to $1 million is much faster than before. There are other trends that are very important, like recurring businesses, which, as you know, investors don't really want to have one-offs in hardware. They also want to have subscription attached to it. This is also happening because consumers are actually buying it, and corporations are used to it. And so companies are articulating all that, and I think there are a few giants that are dormant at the moment that people don't really see or hear about that are being built, and many more spectacular companies I think that are coming up, and so we're still very bullish on the industry.
Awesome. Yeah, great overview. But I think we need to, you mentioned before, but I think we need to talk a little bit more about the funding. We usually hear that hardware it's more challenging, need more money, and there's the crowdfunding, the investment fund. Not a lot of VC investing in hardware as in software and SaaS, but how do you see the role of fundraising in hardware? As people say that is more needed than in software. So how do you see this in hardware, in your experience, this special role for hardware startups?
Yes, it's not easy, but I will say first of all that there are more investors investing in hardware than before. So it's kind of the good news because before there were maybe like 3 people. So we've at least 3x that nowadays. But more seriously, every investor will consider, I think, a proposition that has some hardware in it. In particular, because the business models start to get validated on the SaaS side of things. And so it's easier to open the door and have a conversation and maybe get funded. And overall, I would say that in the same vein, at least from our perspective and what we see, the number of hardware startups being funded, keep on growing. And so there is, I think, another reason to that is that the cost of hardware is getting slightly lighter. And that means that you can actually develop a product for a bit cheaper. You can deploy them for cheaper, and the ROI of those propositions are maybe better as well, thanks to the unfair advantage or whatever those companies had before to articulate kind of their vision and then their first pilots and whatnot. On the other side, kind of the same idea from the corporation standpoint. I think most of them are playing the game. It's always difficult to get paid. It's always difficult to have larger pilots and that kind of thing. It's a kind of a different thing, but at least the ecosystem, I think, is reacting to it, which starts to make things possible. So what would have been deemed impossible before is now kind of possible, and then you evolve in a realm of how much money is it going to take, and when can you start to break even. And here it's more about the trends, as I mentioned before, kind of like consumer, not so hot at the moment, in particular because of the flameouts of the last 2-3 years, like Juicero or like Jaibo or many that have lost hundreds of millions of dollars, in Theranos in health or that kind of thing, don't really help. But sometimes and often it's actually when that's the opportunity is striking, and people are starting to be able to use new tools. And crowdfunding is still very much alive. It sounds like it, of course, went at a very high and kind of doubled down a bit, but still an excellent tool, I think, for companies to use and whatnot. And so fundraising is still there at seed and pre-seed. You can see 1 million, 2 million dollar rounds for companies that have a prototype and have a bit of a few pilots or something. So that's happening. The key is definitely the Series A, but it's kind of always the same thing. It's the same thing in software with that gap here, but it's also still happening. And I think there is an inflection point in hardware at the Series B, in particular because the companies at that point most likely have deployed hundreds or thousands of units somewhere, and therefore have kind of validated their business model, which makes making the investment less risky and somewhat easier out there. So like in all things, I think we need more, again, role models. We need really big successes that we can point at. There are some that happened in the past, but we need to see more of those, and I think they will be happening and making again fundraising easier than what it is today.
Awesome. Yeah, great insights again. And we are getting to the end of our time. We have a few more minutes, and before your final words, I really would like to thank you again in the name of the Case and Startup Summit, and also in the name of all the makers and crazy hardware entrepreneurs for the opportunity to share a little bit your story with us, and of course the benefit that you brought to the hardware community all over the world, because here at Hards we were so inspired by hacks, and because we studied you guys and understand how we could simulate something like that here in Brazil, and we are trying to figure out our journey. So I really want to thank you. And if you have any other final words for the Brazilian ecosystem, any other tips that you like to say for hardware entrepreneurs, and please just.
Absolutely, yeah. As I mentioned, I think it's important for people to travel the world as much as they can, and so that will be when they can, advice number one. Short of that, I think there are still really strong ways to get connected and move forward for prototyping, even from distance and even locally. And if you are in a maker ecosystem, it's always a good thing to get to learn the kinks of electronics, and from there start to experiment as well. So we know now that everything will have a computer in it, and therefore it's just for you to imagine what that could be. We welcome Brazilian entrepreneurs anywhere we are, and I'm looking forward to actually invest in more Latin America companies as well, because we all know it's booming, it has many needs, and we'll build different types of companies for sure in the hardware space that are relevant to the local ecosystem. So kind of what happened with software will happen with hardware. It's just 10 years later, if you will, which I think is interesting to think about. Look at what's going on in software in your country, and you will see what you can do in hardware in 10 years.
Awesome. So thank you again, Cyril. That's it. This Case Startup Summit. It's awesome this year. Hope you all like it, and see you guys.
Take care.